here at San Jose State, and to have a chance to talk to you about a book that is a surprise even to me. The title of the book is The Grace of Silence, and underneath it says a memoir. And it seems because this was not the book that I set out to write. I intended to write a book about America's conversation on race. It would grow out of something I did on the radio, a series of conversations. They aired on both Morning Edition and All Things Considered. We brought a group of voters together, diverse voters, 15 of them. Met with them repeatedly, to help lubricate the conversation, and talked openly about race, a subject that we don't always talk openly about. Oftentimes the filters engage and we're very careful about what we say. It was magical radio. I don't say that about much of what I did. This really was very special. Not because we used a lot of high production values. It was magical because you heard things that you don't normally get to hear. People talking out loud about a subject that they're normally very careful about. At the end of that, I wanted more. I wanted to eavesdrop on the hidden conversation around the country. I believe strongly that in the run-up to the election of Barack Obama, in the wake of the election of President Obama, that Americans across the country were thinking about race and talking about race in very animated ways, despite all this talk about a post-racial America. So my goal was to listen in on that hidden conversation about race and write about it from several different perspectives. Again, writing about other people. What happened was when I attuned my frequency to try to pick up that hidden conversation, I started to pick up a lot of conversation in my own family also. I was listening carefully. I realized that the hidden conversation in my own family was changing. And that the things that I had taken for granted for years, the people that I thought I knew and understood so well, had kept things from me. Suddenly, these things were spilling out. You know, when I grew up, I was told all the time to think about this prize, to keep my eye on this prize. You've heard that phrase, keep your eye on the prize. I heard it all the time in the household where I grew up. When I was young, I didn't really understand what that meant. And when you're a kid, you think about a prize, you're very excited. Ooh, it's going to have a bow on it. It was something that we were supposed to aspire to, but there was no guarantee that we would ever touch it. Then something happened in the run-up to this election, and certainly after the inauguration. I think this happened all over the country. I know what happened in households of color in particular ways, and I certainly know what happened in my household, because all these people who had been talking about this prize that was off in the distance through the hot sands of time and across some moat of boiling oil, suddenly felt that this prize was right in front of them. And they could see it and smell it and taste it, and they feel it when they picked up a number 2 pencil and filled in a little circle. And even if they didn't agree with Barack Obama, if they didn't even belong to his political party, they still felt the earth shift somehow when they picked up the paper, he looks like my grandson. And in that shift, they started talking about things they had kept to themselves. They exhaled, and all these things came out. I learned profound things about my family, I learned profound things about my country, and I realized even though these things were never talked about, they shaped me in some way nonetheless. Both of the big revelations I learned from uncles, but there were also a series of smaller revelations I learned along the way that really taught me so much about this country. Among the big things I learned from an uncle who shared a story with me, perhaps because he knows I'm a journalist and I would go digging, was that my grandmother, a woman I thought I knew so well, spent a portion of her time doing some work that my mother never talked about, an itinerant Aunt Jemima. And I'm looking closely at your faces because when I tell people this, they cock their head and they say, what does that mean? So I'll explain it to you. It means that she traveled to small towns doing pancake demonstrations, dressed up in a headscarf and a hoop skirt, playing the role of Aunt Jemima, hawking a product that was new and novel at the time, pancake story. She said, talk about this when I'm gone, which is a really scary thing to hear. But I knew I had to know more. I had to try to find out, what was this about? What do you mean she traveled? She traveled. In the late 1940s and the 50s, she traveled. Women didn't travel in that time. Women of color certainly didn't travel. I needed to know more. My mother was she had a series of very complicated emotions attached to this, as did her sibs, except for the uncle who told me this story. And one of the reasons that it was surprising to me, and not shameful, but surprising, was because the image didn't fit with the image that I remember of my grandmother. My grandmother, Ione Brown, was not a big woman, but she was big in stature. She was enormously bossy. And she was very polished in a way that women just don't dress anymore. I mean, she would wear these pastel ensembles that were worthy of high church, even if she was just going to the grocery store. And everything had to match. It was like Garanimals, you know, like the outfit just head to toe, the scarf picked up, the pastel outfit. You are all college students, and you walk around town. That she saw her work as something that was worthy. I know this because I love it. As a journalist, I knew how to go digging. And I found newspaper clippings that described grandmother's work. Aunt Jemima's coming to town. You see, she had a 6-state region. I grew up in Minnesota, that was one of her states. She also had Wisconsin, Michigan, Iowa, and the Dakotas. There was an Aunt Jemima who worked this region. She came to small towns throughout California and did pancake demonstrations at county fairs and at grocery stores. My grandmother did it in the Midwest. And I learned from the way she talked about her work to the reporter that there was no shame, at least in description, in what she talked about. She always thought that diction was very important. When I was growing up, if we were using slang in the household, she would say something to us like, well, did you leave the G outside the door? Can you tell him to come inside and like complete the entire word? When she worked as Aunt Jemima, she talked about how she would sing songs because it was important that the people that she was serving knew that she was a church woman. She carried herself in a certain way because she talked about going to small towns and knowing that it was the first time that people in these small towns in the Midwest had seen a person of color. And she wanted them to know what she was about. She took the hand she was dealt, and she dealt with it in her own way. If you met Ione Brown in the late 1940s and 1950s and saw this well-spoken woman serving pancakes, it would be very different than the Aunt Jemima that you would meet if you picked up a magazine at the time. Quaker Oats, the company she worked with, was a massive advertiser. They ran big, full-spread ads in magazines like Ladies' Home Journal and Saturday Review. And in those ads, Aunt Jemima didn't speak with perfect diction. She spoke with a sort of slave patois, spelled out very carefully in language to let you know that she said lazy, and words like that, spelled out so you would understand them. So what I learned is that Quaker Oats got more than they bargained for when they hired Ione Brown. She took that role and used it she served as an ambassador in some ways, and that helped my mother take a history that she had a hard time embracing and see it in a different way. It was a gift in some ways to my mother, and my mother started opening up and telling stories. So I went from the surprise that I learned, I went from this period where I was sort of frozen out from learning anything else from my elders to then a point where they suddenly started telling their stories, the spigot, and I learned amazing things. On the other side of my family, Mom kept from her a profound secret. See, another one of my uncles was going through this sort of historical indigestion and throwing stories of his own, and I learned from another uncle on the other side of the family that my father carried a secret around with him also. My father was a postal worker, as was my mother, and he was very kind in the first 1 or 2 sentences to describe him. He liked things a certain way. He liked rules. And he was very careful in his presentation and everything, the way he carried himself, the way we kept our home, the way he kept cars. Everything was sort of by the book, and everything was always in order. What I learned from my uncle, again in this period of disinhibition, was that father had carried around a secret all his life, and he never talked about it.